All right, we're back, and we're back with Eddie today. Hey, Eddie,
Hey, Zach.
welcome back to us talking about economics. Woo!
Yeah, happy to be back. I'm glad we're
Sounds
doing this.
good.
Yeah.
So what Eddie wanted to talk about today is he is putting together his capital consumption theory, and he sent it over to me to look over and do some edits. And when he sent it over to me, I was really excited. I started doing some like economic talking, and then he was like, "Well, I was actually thinking about trying to have it be relatable to people." And I was like, "Oh, no wonder you wanted me to edit it, not because I'm super economic smart, but because I relate to the average person, the not the economics, the average person." And no,
You're at least interested because there's at least like half of people who would be like, what are we doing? Get me
yeah,
out of here.
yep. But he actually had some really interesting things to say, and so I will let Eddie take over. What, how are you putting together capital consumption theory? What's going on in your brain about it?
So, um, yeah, one of the things I've been capital consumption theory has been, these ideas that have come to me, sort of in the last year or so, especially around thinking about basic income and thinking about the very kind of special place that we are in with economics, with the economy right now. Um, and I've been tweeting about it, and I talk about discussion groups sometimes. And after interacting with people more, I'm realizing that I that even though I talk about it, like a lot of it is not really getting across, and I think there's a lot of things that I have to kind of a lot of things that I assume people have in their heads that I actually have to talk about that to make it make sense to people. So
One of the things I say is that in order to have a productive conversation about anything in society, you first have to go through about 16 definitions in order to make sure you're actually on the same page.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a good saying. That
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense,
And
especially
so
in politics,
I
right?
yeah, I
Yeah,
think what you're trying to do is trying to define some things and really dig into what it means, what
yeah,
your thinking is.
absolutely. So one of the things that came up right away, I've started what I hope will become the kind of introduction to capital consumption theory, as a first draft outline and sent it to Zach. And one of the first things that came up was about productivity growth, um, which is related to real investment, and it's related to capital. Um, so, and I realized after reading what Zach wrote that this is actually something that economists don't talk about. Like a lot of economists and people in finance, I think will sort of catch on and like start sort of understand these types of things just intuitively. But like I realized that when you go to econ 101 in high school or college, they talk about Adam Smith and the value of trade. They talk about Keynes and they talk about economic management, but they don't talk about capital. I
Mm.
think it's a little bit like maybe it has a little bit of hangover from like it's a little bit taboo to talk about capital because Marx talked about capital, and then we had the Cold War, Soviet Union, and like I think that like economists they just don't talk about it anymore, and that's a pity because capital and productivity growth underlie like the entire of our economic society. So if you think about it, like 300 years ago, 300 years ago, we were basically an agricultural economy. Like 90% of people, all of their labor just went into growing enough food for everyone to eat. that was 90% of the economy, and 90% of the labor input went just to, growing food. That was it. That's it.
And so
And
there was a big push to have more people so you could grow more food, and it was all about land, and that's why we
right,
have wars, and it's all about food and more people and more blah blah blah.
right, absolutely. I mean, that was the, sort of the, there's a sort of a ceiling, like, in that agricultural society, where, the land only produces so much. And that's like your capacity constraint, like, and Malthus's idea that, when the population grows past that constraint, you start not having enough food for everybody. So then you have famine, and you have pestilence, you have plagues because people are weakened from not having enough food to eat. And you have wars because people are, because there's, a lot of conflict, again, when people don't have enough to eat. But to go back to capital, so fast forward, so we're now in the 21st century, and we produce way more than we did back then. So now, agricultural output is just like 5% of our economy. So only 5% of people or less, I think it's like 3% actually, work in producing enough food for everyone. So we get the same output. Everybody still eats, and they probably eat better than they did in the past. Um, but you manage to do that with only 3% of labor input instead of 90%. And the way that, is possible is because of mechanized farming. So, you go to a farm, and it's this enormous thing, and they use these machines that have these really long arms. They're mechanized, and they just drive the tractors and the I'm not a farming expert, but everybody, you get the picture. They drive that thing around and around, and they perform lots and lots of 30 times they get 30 times the output from their labor that they would be able to get if they did not have those machines. If they didn't have those machines, then there's no way they could farm that much land. They would just not have enough time and energy to do that.
Capital being the mechanized equipment, and just to let you know, your camera is backwards
Right.
right now. Farming equipment being the capital, and it being kind of a force multiplier. So instead of one person creating 3 carrots every day, it's now one person's making 30,000 carrots every day.
Exactly.
And just to let you know, I looked it up, and it's actually 1.3% of American workers work in agriculture now. So
Right.
even less than 3%.
Even less, 1.3% from 9%. So that's like, 60-fold increase in the productivity of that farm labor. You're getting 60 times the output for the same labor. That's a 60-fold increase in productivity growth. And that is, almost, if you think about all the, different ways that we have had productivity growth, and our production has gone up, there is essentially capital underlying all of that. In fact, I would even define capital as basically anything that gives you a productivity benefit is capital. That's not the standard definition. But that is the way that I would define capital. It is any type of thing like your, mechanized farm equipment, that to get that mechanized farm equipment, there's a certain amount of like science and I blipped, didn't I?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you did.
To get that capital in place, to get that farm equipment in place, there's a certain amount of science and technology that you have to do. There's a certain investment into having that farm equipment, kind of come into place. And some of it, it's actually the last step, really. It's only the farmer buying his tractor and equipment, which shows up on his balance sheets, on his financial records, saying that, oh, I spent $10,000 on farm equipment today. There is actually like a certain amount of like communal capital that is behind that, because there was somebody at some point who did the science, uh, the basic chemistry and physics involved with, how do you build an internal combustion engine. And then there were more people that, made the ICE a reality. And those patents last for 30 years, and then they're out. So all of that has become communalized, but there's investment in our history which supports that, that level of productivity growth that we now have.
Makes sense.
So right. So if you imagine that we have like a, so to turn it into a bit of an analogy, imagine we have like a sort of a big golf club, and there's a maintenance guy, and he has to keep the grass all mown. And so there's 4 stages that the golf club can go through. In the first one, he's using like one of those push mowers, non-motorized push mowers that have the blades that like spin around when you push it. And then the second stage, he goes to like a walk behind mower that he still has to push. And then he goes to the riding mower, the kind that Forrest Gump used, and, he's riding around. And then the last stage is what they have now, which is like robot mowers, which, mow the lawn themselves, and he doesn't even have to be there. So as you go through those 4 stages, the maintenance guy has, he has 8 hours a day. He can use 8 hours a day of labor throughout the process. But, in the first stage, those 8 hours are going to convert to like, a much smaller area of lawn mowed. And as you go through the productivity growth, the stages, his output goes way up. So where to go with it? So
what I kind of talk about a lot of times, I talk about the labor, the
yeah,
idea. When we talk about, one of the things I think about is when our labor costs go down,
yeah,
people kind of assume that's a bad thing, but it's
right,
actually a good thing for our community as a whole. Is we're
yeah,
getting more efficient, we're getting process efficiencies. We're also having trainings that are way more simple to do. We can replace people a lot easier, which is a good thing. There are externalities of people not being able to buy stuff anymore, but
right,
having labor costs go down is actually a good result.
yeah. So you've gotten right to the crux of the question, and this is exactly the thing that we have to examine here. Um, in the 18th century, these business people were buying like these mechanized looms, and using mechanized looms to have enormous output of textiles. And they had the Luddite movement. Do you know about the Luddite movement?
I believe I do. I mean, I only know of it in the meme version where it's Luddite. Don't be a Luddite. Come on, guys.
Right, right. So the Luddites were like handcrafters. They were doing textiles by hand. And so these mechanized looms come along, and the mechanized looms are way more efficient. They create much more textile, and so the cost of the textile is way cheaper. So that was putting huge pressure on the traditional like handcrafters. And so they had this whole movement where they were like going into factories and smashing mechanized looms, because they were like, you're taking away our livelihood, um, that movement got crushed. And ever since then, like economists talk about, oh, like if you say anything about the negative effects of productivity growth, then economists are like, oh, you're a Luddite. Clearly this is a good thing. It is a good thing. But on the other hand, if you think about it, at the micro level, the Luddites are correct that when you introduce that robot lawnmower, you have definitely, and if you only have a finite amount of lawn that you need mowed, you've definitely thrown reduced the need for labor and potentially thrown people out of work. So here is where it gets interesting, because at this point, this is where economists will say, they'll say, but productivity growth is good. Productivity growth allows wages to increase because the labor is more productive. And I would argue that at that point, when they say that, they're actually doing like some hand waving. They're like, they didn't actually examine the entire thing, and the actual mechanism is worth examining. It's worth looking at what happens here. So it is true that let's see, which direction do I go here? So there is there's actually an economist who's like a bona fide professor, not like me because I'm not an economics professor, but his name is Jeff Crocker. And he has this entire, he wrote this entire book, and he has this entire thing about how people don't have enough money in their hands, and that the economy is like substituting debt. Because people don't have money to buy, the debt levels are going way up to allow them to buy. And the reason this is happening is because it is a high productivity economy. And so his point is that, you need that in a high productivity economy, you have this, kind of, he doesn't go into this explicitly, but, the idea is that if your productivity is really high, then your need for labor is lower. Your labor income is going to be lower, so people are not going to have enough money. But this is a little bit of a sticky issue. So the problem with so we're going to be talking about this for a while, so we're going to have to kind of circle around here a little bit. The problem with Jeff Crocker's view is that it has, when you talk about the Luddites, the economists themselves, they don't have a reasoned argument for why productivity growth will definitely benefit the workers. I mean, as the Luddites saw, the direct effect of the automation of the productivity growth is definitely going to be a reduction in labor demand. And that's definitely going to involve throwing people out of work. But, maybe something happens that the workers end up better off later on. But we want to examine, and not just assume, but to look at what exactly is it that happens, and how does that work?
So this is where, if I'm understanding this right, you're talking about, this is where Andrew Yang would say, and they would say, now these people are going to be retrained for a better job in the future. Yay. And
right.
then, but in reality, what happens is nothing.
Something different.
Yeah, something different. Is that retraining doesn't always work all the time, is that I think you're going to go into this, is that there's not necessarily an incentive for all of these people to get caught back into society.
So this is really the heart of capital consumption theory. And from a ground level, when you're on the ground, and Andrew Yang goes and looks at all the data, and he's like, okay, how did these training programs do? And he looks at it, and it turns out that they did really terribly. There are data that say that people who did not go into the training program, sorry about that, they actually did better. They had better outcomes than the people who did go into the training program. Apparently the training program was worse than not useful. It was actually, it actually hurt people's chances of getting
awful.
But the question again, from a sort of an economic, from an economist's viewpoint, what the question is, what is going on here, and what is supposed to happen. So if you're so we've got two camps here. So we've got let's divide them, first into the productivity good, productivity bad group. So productivity good is kind of most economists, mainstream economists, but we're saying that they've actually not really made their case. Um, and then productivity bad group, you have like sort of Andrew Yang and sort of like Jeff Crocker. They're saying, there are definitely these unmitigated effects of productivity growth that we have to do something about. Now, if we go back to the group that's saying productivity is good, these mainstream economists and whatnot, they do have something in favor of the argument. And what they have in favor of the argument is that, the Luddites were in, I think, the early 19th century. It's now been about 200 years. And they were sort of scared that like the worker would not have, work to do. And 200 years later, I mean, the worker still has work to do, right?
I do.
So
Yep.
clearly, they were not like, I mean, it wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't the end of labor. Something happened.
Like,
They're not.
yeah, that's like, the Luddites is now a meme, is you can make fun of somebody for being a Luddite because they were so wrong over 200 years. Yeah.
So history apparently tells us that something happens and the workers are still fine. But the question is, and I would argue that nobody has looked into this in a detailed enough way, what exactly happens?
And for which workers too, I would say, right?
Mm, right, right. So, um, so this is what I realized. I realized that there is an even worse thing about the productivity growth and the reduction in labor demand.
And what is that worst thing?
I'm thinking about whether I should talk about something earlier or later. So
What
let's
what you
put back.
got? What you got for us?
So what I gotta say is it's actually worse than you look at first, because the thing is that um, so the thing that we hope happens is that the economy comes up with like more jobs, and so these out of work um, workers find something else to do. But if you look at it, the thing is that what do jobs depend on? Jobs occur when spending occurs. So as a consumer, when you spend money on something, you buy an item of clothing, you go to restaurants, then there is employment that happens because of your spending. So somebody has to make those clothes, somebody has to make that food, somebody has to serve you. There's all this employment that occurs because you're spending money. So employment depends on spending. What does spending depend on?
Having money.
Spending depends on having money. And people in general, most people have money because they're working and they have labor income. So when your productivity growth is pushing down on your labor demand and pushing down on your labor income, not only is it like a first order effect, like, oh, that's a bad thing, that's a trouble. There's also a second order effect. It's also a vicious cycle, because when people are out of work because they've been automated and they don't have money to spend, then that would put even more people out of work, because if they're out of work and they can't go to the restaurant, and enough people are out of work and can't go to the restaurant, then the restaurant also starts having trouble. The restaurant also starts people off,
And
and that
I'd like to say too, like, I think
yeah,
it's really important to point out where the money is going, because the money doesn't disappear, it's just being captured by different people. And that's the important part. Where, like, the part is, where are the people and what are they spending their money on, right?
absolutely. You're skipping ahead. You're
Oh, okay.
skipping ahead.
All right.
We'll get there. That's very good. But right now we're saying, so that the spending, so labor income being pushed down by productivity growth, um, is not only bad because people have less income, it's also bad because having less income causes them to spend less, which causes more people to have even less income. So it's almost like we're going to like the long route. We're going to do the long version. So we're going to include here that this is almost like the paradox of thrift, which they do teach in Econ 101. So the paradox of thrift, is made famous by Keynes, by Keynes, and the paradox of thrift is this idea that if you think about an economy, and you have sort of multiple agents, and they're all spending money with each other. So every time they take the money and they spend it with somebody else has it, and then they spend it with somebody else. So it's the paradox of thrift is a thought experiment where you say, what happens if everybody tries to save their money instead of spending it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the thing about it is that when people are saving their money, they're doing that. So you save some money by saying, you know what, I'm going to not buy coffee today. I'm not going to cut out, some of the ice cream that I eat, this week. You're going to spend less money on coffee or ice cream or whatever, clothes or whatever. The thing is that in the economy, there's somebody else who was going to sell you the coffee or the ice cream or the clothes, who now has less income because you saved your money and you didn't spend it with them. And so if you think about it, in an economy with everybody spending money with each other, if everybody starts trying to save their money, everybody's income actually goes down because of the savings. When people don't spend and they save instead, then the income in the economy goes down. And so so you end up with sort of nobody's able to save money, but the economy contracts. Like the level of income, the level of GDP just goes down because everybody's afraid to spend.
I'd like to bookmark this because this is exactly what I'd like to talk about probably in the future of our conversation. So don't forget this whole point right here because this is
Yeah.
very important.
Okay. Right. So I wrote an article when I was first starting with these ideas, and it talks about the paradox of thrift. But when I went back to it like months later, and the more I thought about it, I realized that it is similar to the paradox of thrift, but it is actually slightly different. And the way that it's different is actually key to why economists kind of don't get it. They actually do not understand what's going on. They're all scratching their heads if they're really honest. And they're all like kind of saying things like, maybe deflation will happen, maybe inflation will happen. We kind of have no idea. But I think, it's deflation that we got to be worried about. They don't know what's going on and they don't know how to figure it out. And the thing is that, so again, the thing we were talking about was consumer workers having their income, decrease because of automation. And when their income decreases, when their income decreases, there's a second one that you have to worry about.
All right, sorry about that, Skip. And Eddie, back to you.
So we were talking about the paradox of thrift, and we're talking about something now that looks like the paradox of thrift, but it's slightly different. Again, we were talking about the worker consumer, and with automation, the worker consumer kind of loses labor income, and we have to worry not just about the labor income that is lost, but we also have to worry that because he's getting less labor income.
Hey, Eddie, can I pause you right there? I think your finger might be over the mic.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
There
Let me do
go.
that again.
Okay, perfect.
Right. So we were talking about something that looks like the paradox of thrift, but it's actually different. So, again, we were talking about when the worker consumer loses labor income because of automation, we have to worry about not just the income that he lost. We also have to worry about the fact that having lost income, he now reduces his spending. And by reducing his spending, that causes even more people to lose labor income because less spending is happening.
Makes sense.
That makes sense, and it looks quite similar to it's quite similar to the paradox of thrift, but it's slightly different. And here's where it is different. So if you go back to the paradox of thrift, where it was like a multi-agent economy, and think about what's going on there and why people reduced their spending in the paradox of thrift experiment. What was the reason? Why did they reduce their spending?
Because they were trying to save.
Because they were trying to save. And the standard way that people think about paradox of thrift is sort of like what happens in a recession. And I think a paradox of thrift is absolutely what happens in a recession. And it's like people begin to worry about the economy. And so as a result, they want to kind of save some money so that, so that they don't get in a bad place. So they reduce their spending. And as a result, the economy, goes down because everybody's trying to save. That's actually, relevant to a recession, but it occurs. You have to pay attention. It's sort of a psychological thing. It is a fear-based thing. That's why economists are always looking at consumer confidence, business confidence, and whatever. It is this psychological behavioral thing where people are like, I'm worried about the economy. I'm going to spend less. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I always remember in the recession, and remember hearing on the news, the American consumer is always consistent, and it's one of the reasons we have a great economy is because we're terrible at saving money and we just keep spending it.
Right. So
And
this is where you have like, Roosevelt saying the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, FDR. And so when you're thinking about the paradox of thrift, and it's a psychological behavioral thing, if everybody, you can imagine if everybody kind of went to sleep one day and then woke up the next morning and somehow like you had done something to their brain and they like woke up in the morning and they forgot that they were in a recession or they forgot that a recession was coming, that would, based on this understanding that you have, that would fix the recession. That would fix the paradox of thrift. If everybody was not scared because they'd forgotten, then they would go out and spend as normal and the economy would run as normal. That is the paradox of thrift. And that is a valid mechanism. What we're talking about, to go back, is something that is similar, but it's different. And it's a key way that it's different is that where the paradox of thrift is psychological and behavioral, the paradox, what I'm calling the paradox of the worker consumer, is structural. So if all the workers, went to sleep one night and you did something with their brain and they woke up and they forgot that they had been laid off because of automation, you wake up in the morning and it's different from the paradox of thrift situation. They still have a problem. They may have forgotten, but sooner or later they're going to figure out, they're going to go to work and the company is going to say, nope, sorry, you don't have a job here.
you can come here, we just won't pay you.
Exactly, right. Still, they're still not going to have the income to spend. And it's not a psychological thing. It is a structural thing. It's a real thing where they do not have income. And if they don't have income, it does not matter how confident they are, they're not going to be able to spend. It's structural. So as a result of being structural, it is something that occurs that moves on a longer time scale.
It won't be self-correcting in terms of.
It won't be self-correcting. Yeah. I mean, people, when they get in a bad mood and they get anxious, people's moods like change all the time. Mm-hmm. And, eventually you get out of the bad mood usually. And eventually, kind of self-corrects, and people, as soon as people start spending and, you have the Fed stepping in and whatnot, the recession kind of generally self-corrects. But what I would say is a depression is that, and recessions happen like every 7 years or so. Quick thing about recessions, the word recession was invented after the Great Depression, and then they hit a rough spot and they were like, oh, we have a downturn, but it's not as bad as the Great Depression was, so we're going to call it a recession. So there's no actually, like, there's no, the word, and again, it reflects understanding that there's actually not like a very solid definitional difference between a recession and a depression. But I'm going to say here, I'm going to define it and say that the recession is that little downturn that you have like every 7 years, 10 years, and it self corrects. And it's based on the paradox of thrift. So it's sort of psychological. It's like everybody gets worried about the economy at the same time, so the economy goes down. That's a recession. A depression, I'm now arguing, is based on that structural paradox of the worker consumer. So what you have happening is you have productivity growth, occurring all the time. It's continual ever since the 1700s to now. There's it's just continued. We continuing to have more and more productivity growth. I mean, science and technology are always progressing, so we always continue to have more productivity growth. That places a drag on labor income, and labor income places a drag on spending, which then places a drag on labor income again.
So what you're
So
saying is it's a snowball.
exactly, it is a snowball effect. It's what electrical engineers call a positive feedback loop, and
Yeah.
control theorists, they call this a positive feedback loop, where you have the labor income, and it causes something else. Like if it decreases, it causes labor spending to decrease. Spending decreasing causes labor income to decrease again. So that's a positive feedback loop. And what you end up having with positive feedback loops is that you get this sort of like either a spike or going down, either going down to zero. It's sort of in control theory, you have negative feedback loops where it's like your thermometer in your room works as a negative feedback loop, where if the temperature goes down, then the heater turns on, which brings the temperature back up. And then when it goes down again, the heater comes on and it brings it back up. So negative feedback loop keeps things stable. But a positive feedback loops causes instability, causes something to go either like it does like a sort of an exponential thing where it may start off slowly and then it spikes. And you could imagine it in either direction.
So
This is what
positive
we're
can
saying.
go down.
A positive feedback loop can go down, and going down is just a matter of definition, actually.
Okay.
So like
Okay, that makes sense. So I
say
was
that the
always thinking negative feedback loop was the same thing as a positive, but bad. But
right,
negative is something where it goes boop boop. Okay.
right, so they're different. The negative feedback loop is like the thermometer, where a perturbation in one direction causes a reaction in the other direction, and so you
Okay.
end up that's basically stable.
Okay.
That's a negative feedback loop. Positive feedback loop is where
It's just exponential.
right, it's exponential. Like something that people run into is when you're doing audio and the sound from the speaker manages to get back into the mic, and then the mic amplifies it, which causes the sound to get louder, and so that your speaker kind of goes like it,
Yeah.
very rapidly, hits the limits of the system. That's positive feedback. It's because the sound in the mic is going to the speaker, coming back to the mic at a higher amplitude, and then it goes to the speaker again. It goes, so the
It's like
increase causes
dividing by
more.
zero.
Right. That's positive feedback loop. There are tons of other examples. In biology, positive feedback loops are all around.
Okay.
But the point is that it causes this thing. So what we're saying is that the paradox of the worker consumer causes aggregate demand over time. At first, it's just a drag, but it gets worse and worse, and eventually it crashes. So the crash was the Great Depression, 1930s. And we're actually arguing that we're in a similar situation now. We have the same thing going on right now. And ever since 2008, you've had this situation where like the Federal Reserve, like monetary policy and fiscal policy, they're kind of trying everything they can to keep the economy going, but it just seems to get harder and harder. And so that I'm arguing that is because of the operation paradox of the worker consumer on aggregate spending, aggregate demand, and aggregate spending is causing it to, be pushed down really hard. Fed's trying really hard to keep it up, but no matter how far down, you have the interest rates down all the way to zero, but the economy is still sort of like sagging, still sort of like sagging downwards a little bit.
And we would argue that interest rates are not the correct tool to be bringing to. I mean, it can be part of a toolkit, but not it. No matter how low you bring interest rates, it's not going to solve the problem of the consumer worker paradox.
That I would, and that's a really interesting point, and it probably takes like another half hour to explain it. So let's put that down as a topic for the next time. But does what I said, does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
So the
No,
conclusion,
definitely.
so my conclusion is that the paradox of the worker consumer causes the Great Depression, and it's trying to cause a Great Depression again in this time. But then again, you have the question: so what brings you out of the Great Depression? Because the Great Depression ended, and so the idea is that you get this crash, and it goes down, 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 down. As it gets worse and worse, there is a limit that you get to eventually. So at some point, during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the misery gets so bad. And if you know a little bit about the economic history there, there were a lot of like new things that happened then. So, prior to the Great Depression, like the government generally operated on a balanced budget prior to the Great Depression. Like they only spent as much money as they were taxing. Great Depression comes along, economy keeps going down. People are getting more and more miserable. It was like 4 years between 1929 crash to like 1934, which is sort of like the bottom, but sort of the bottom of the Great Depression. But you don't get completely out until about 1936, 1937 maybe. But as the misery goes up, eventually you reach a point where the government is like saying, it's sort of like today, like the people, in the society are just like screaming, like, and the government eventually reaches a point where they cannot not do something about this, because if they don't do something about it, they're going to have like a revolution.
Yeah.
Like they're going
And
to have,
what
right
I've
back
heard
then,
is like
communism. Right.
the people in Greece, the point they said, and what they whatever it takes. They
Yeah,
got to the point where they said, whatever it takes, we'll get it done.
right, right. So in the 1930s, like you had a lot of stuff like we came off of the gold standard, so we started basically quantitative easing. In the 1930s is the first time we started printing money, because we got off the gold standard, which allowed us to do that. You had a lot of you had fiscal policy. You had Keynes, was writing in the 1930s and arguing for both monetary policy and fiscal policy, and arguing what is taught in economics textbooks today, which is that aggregate spending and aggregate demand are not self-regulating. They need to be managed. And they did that by having fiscal policy back then, monetary policy back then, Social Security, began in around that time. Again, because you had lots of kind of poverty and misery among older people, and eventually got so bad where they said, we have to do something about this. So all of those things, eventually they do work. Eventually you get enough spending going, you get enough economic stimulus going, that that things improve. So this is where things are interesting, because remember, this is a positive feedback loop with labor income spending going back to labor income. And you asked about directions back then. And the interesting thing about the paradox of the worker consumer, actually the paradox of thrift is actually the same, but the paradox of worker consumer works in both directions. So if you get like, you're in the 1930s and suddenly, like never before happened, the government starts spending lots of money on public works. They start sending out social security to people. They start, easing so that relieves the pressure. They're basically helping out that they start helping out the debtors who were having a lot of problems with inflation, where the loans were getting, more and more bigger and bigger due to the dollar getting more valuable. So they start helping out the debtors. All of these things eventually they help spending to finally increase again. When spending increases, again, when you spend money on stuff, then the businesses, the restaurants, the clothing manufacturers, whatever, they actually have to hire to keep up with the increased demand and increased spending. So as a result, you get more labor income from your increased spending. And then once people have more money in their hands, then they go back out and they spend it again. So it's a positive feedback loop in both directions. In when it's crashing, the crash gets like more and more crashy. And when you finally manage to like turn it around, it also goes upwards. And so, from the Great Depression until the 1970s was like one of the like golden periods of the economy. Like all economists are like, oh yeah, that was a great time. They had lots of productivity growth. They had, consumer incomes going up. Inequality was not yet was actually getting better at that time. And everything was great almost. They had a little bit of inflation, but it wasn't very troublesome. It started off at like 3%, 4%. But again, that kind of and that leads up to the next thing. So what happens now? You have the positive feedback loop working in the positive direction, pulling the economy up and up and up. Labor income going up and up and up. What eventually happens? That's also a positive feedback loop. So it's also going to do this thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about positive feedback loops is that they keep going up until they reach a limit. So what would you think is the limit of that positive feedback loop going on the upwards direction?
So I'm gonna guess from our earlier conversation last
Yeah.
time that it's when we uh, over invest without the consumer backbone enough to support it.
So it's not that complicated. So eventually the spending and everything, the economy gets going until you reach capacity. So
Okay.
the entire economy, every part of the economy and the economy as a whole has a capacity. So your restaurant only fits like 100 people. You can't have more than 100 people in the restaurant at one time. Your factory, it has like 3 production lines, and the most of those 3, there's a certain capacity, like there's a maximum amount that the factory can do. Economists, they actually measure this by going around to businesses and saying, if you did not have to worry about like customers buying, like if customers were guaranteed to buy everything that you produced, how much could you produce this month? And businesses, they can answer that because they know how many people the restaurant fits, they know how many production lines they have. If they're in the primary industry and they're doing like lumber or oil or something, they know how many wells they have, they know how many logging machines they have or whatever. There is a capacity in the economy. And so if your spending and your labor income is going up and up and up, which I would argue it did from the Great Depression until the 1970s, eventually you hit the ceiling of capacity constraints, right? Eventually you get to a point where people want to spend more money. They've got money in their pocket to spend, and they've got income. They're doing great at their job, is paying them fairly well. But the businesses are so busy that they cannot actually give people more production. That's all the production they have. And so when that happens, and they're still seeing demand, you end up getting inflation. Because if you're a factory owner and you're already selling everything that you can make, but people are still like knocking down your door trying to get more, but you can't give them more, what is the rational thing to do to maximize your profits is at that point you start raising your price, right? Because you can only make 1,000 sweaters, but if you make more money on each sweater, then that maximizes your profit. you wouldn't do this if you're not at capacity, because when you're only making 50 sweaters and you can make 100 sweaters, when more customers come to your door, you're like, okay, great, I'll sell you a sweater, I'll sell you a sweater. You don't raise your prices because you want to be using your factory. Your factory is sitting there, partially idle. But when you reach capacity constraint, then that is going to put upwards pressure on prices, and you're going to get inflation. And that's exactly what happened. And if you look at the measure of capacity utilization, according to Fred, FRED, the Federal Reserve, I forget what it stands for, but the Federal Reserve has that little tool online where you can look up lots of different interesting statistics. That is exactly what happens. Capacity utilization goes from a low spot during the Great Depression in the 70s and 60%, and it goes up and up and up. And by the time you get to the 70s, it reaches up above 90%. It's like 92, 93%. And that is exactly the time that you start getting inflation. And then inflation actually kind of goes up, just right along with the capacity utilization. It actually starts in the 60s a little bit. And then you get to the 70s. And then after the 70s, you have Volcker, and you have a big change in government ideas. Like you get Reaganomics, after the 70s and the 80s. And they start, they stop, so they reduce fiscal policy a little bit. Monetary policy, they make it very tight. And they do manage to get capacity utilization to go downwards. And the inflation stops as soon as capacity utilization, goes down below 90%. They did not realize, the economists did not understand that the thing is that after you come off of that limit, after you come off of that limit in the 70s, and you start going downwards again, positive feedback loop. It doesn't just go down a little bit and then stay there. It actually heads downwards, and then it continues to head downwards. Does that make sense? Because the spend causes less income, causes less spending. And so from the 70s until now, you have stagnant labor wages, where the wages, they were going up and up and up from the Great Depression until the 70s. And then the 70s, they just make a very sharp turn, and they just go, they stagnate, and they have not, gone up in the last 40, 50 years from 1970s until now. And that is because we turned the corner on what I call the capital consumption cycle, where instead of spending causing more income, causing more spending, you have in our area, you have less spending causing, like stagnant income. It doesn't go down, but it stagnates. The income stagnates, so the spending stagnates, so the income stagnates. And the wages, despite the economy growing from the 1970s until now, the labor wages in relation to the economy have been down and down and down, because they stagnated. Economy went up. There's this bigger and bigger gap between what the economy produces and what people earn through their labor income. That's a great, so there's more to say about labor demand and labor income, but I actually have to go.
Okay.
But that's sort of the conclusion for today, is that, so this is really the core of capital consumption theory, is that due to the paradox of the worker consumer and the positive feedback loop that generates, you have the economy, you have aggregate spending and aggregate demand that's not stable. It just goes like kind of up and up and up and up until it reaches the roof. And then it goes down and down and down and down until it reaches the floor, which is the Great Depression. And we're approaching that now. And it just kind of like, it actually toggles back and forth like that over an 80-year period. And you have depression at the bottom, and at the top, you have inflation. That's the idea. That's the core.
Well, I think so. What I am understanding is, I think I fully understand now the paradox of the worker consumer, and the idea that it's a positive feedback loop that makes everything go down,
Right.
and
or up.
or up. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And the other thing as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Eddie. I
Okay.
will look forward to the next time we do this again.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. I absolutely totally appreciate it because I really need somebody to talk to about these ideas. Otherwise, it's not clear to me. Like, otherwise, I'm not going to be able to write something that people understand because I don't know which parts that I'm saying and which parts that I'm not saying that I do need to say. Yeah.
Absolutely. I actually like doing podcasts because it helps me for myself talking about things in the future.
Yeah.
It helps me like, okay, that's what that means. So yeah, blah blah blah. Yeah,
Right. Right.
totally
Cool.
get you.
Cool.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, Eddie.
Okay. Thanks, Zach.
All right.